So I want to touch a little bit on what the provost just mentioned, the Georgia State report. 2 years ago, they published a full, I don't know, 30-page report of what they did. And if you get a chance, I would encourage you to read it because one of the things they pointed out, all right, so they did all these analytics to figure out why some sections of this student population was struggling and why some were not. All right, and they pointed out a number of things. Some were things like, the last $2,000, right? So if a student owes the school $2,000, they would drop out instead of, having the money to pay for that. So they developed these micro grants and small loans at very, very low interest to get them to keep. They discovered they had a lot of summer melt, which if you don't know what that is, students would apply, all right, they would get in, they would get accepted, but then when they get accepted, they would get this deluge of financial aid documents and all this paperwork, which for some students, they don't know what the hell they're looking at. And so they actually rather just, I'll just, take a year off or something. So they would have somebody contact the students directly. But in the report, interestingly enough, they said we were able to address so many different elements of the system except what was happening in the classroom. They still were not able to get people to really, truly, fully transform their teaching. And it's interesting because we talk about systems, right? Glenn talks about systems. That's the part of the system that tends to be the most inert. Somehow we still think that if there's any problem in that space, it's because of the students who are in it, right? And this is it's a paradigm shift that is actually fascinating to me, maybe as a researcher here, watching how people are trying to unpack that, right? And I think I've tried to understand that from my own experience. I've tried to understand it from the students' experience, and I'm here to tell you that the way this works, inclusive teaching, I'll be honest with you, when I get invited to places, I know what they want. I'm not saying here, but there's a lot of places that want this, right? They want me to come and give them 5 things they can do on Monday. And then after which, like, all right, I'm inclusive now. Dodge that bullet. That's not how this stuff works, man. All right? For 2 reasons. Number one, when you really have to look in the mirror and understand what it means to live life through the experience of others, that is a hard, a long, and a very deliberate journey. And it's not going to be complete in a week, in a talk, in a workshop, in a semester, or in even 5 years. It's kind of an eternal process. The second thing is teaching doesn't happen in isolation. Okay? So the people who are doing the teaching get compensated, or they're part of a university where they're asked to do other tasks, like run a research program or sit on committees. The university has a budget that spends on things other than teaching. So when you're talking about transforming one part of the system, you have to bear in mind that other aspects of the system have to be impacted as well, or needs to be thought of a bit differently. So when I started my graduate career in STEM, so I guess I didn't really introduce myself, right? In case you didn't pick up an accent, I'm from Trinidad and Tobago. Does anybody know where that is? See, like 3 hands. All right, it's it's the last island. If you're heading south and you're going to Venezuela, it's the last island on the Caribbean archipelago, right? If you get to Caracas, you've gone too far, right? So it's the last island. And I came to Atlanta in 1999. I did my undergraduate at Morehouse College. Spent 4 wonderful years there, and then I went to grad school at Florida International University, right? A large 60,000 students, mostly Hispanic, like 85%, about 10 miles west of the city of Miami. And my master's and PhD was in marine ecology and economics. So when I went to grad school, I was asking around. I was 23, right? So you ask around, what should I be doing to be successful as a grad student? Number one advice, avoid teaching. As much as you could avoid getting a TA-ship, the best, because it's distracting, and what you're really here for is to get data and publish and push your lab forward. So of course I believe that, right? So I got an RA for my master's. I was a scuba diver, so I spent all my time in the field. So when I came back for the PhD, an RA-ship is a lot harder to get as a doctoral student, so I ended up having to TA. And I remember I went to the guy and I asked him, the guy who ran the TA training, and I asked him, so what training do I need to teach? And he said, oh, you're a funny guy, you'll be fine. I am married to an elementary school reading specialist who has taught in the classroom for 15 years. She got an undergrad degree from University of Michigan in education. She did 2 years of teacher training. Then when she started her job, she was an apprentice for 2 years. And even when we moved to New England, after already having taught for 10 years, she had to kind of apprentice before you become sort of permanent to teach 3rd grade reading. I'm a funny guy and I'll be fine. Right? This is what passed for training at the doctoral level. All right? So when I taught this group of students, if you come to my office, you'll see a picture of them in my office, because they remind me from whence I came. They remind me when I walked into a classroom and I didn't know what the hell I was doing. Right? I was given a lab syllabus. I was told no harm, no foul, make sure nobody's injured. And so long as that happens, some education happened in the process, right? But partly because of my personality, partly because, you recognize that once you started to talk to them about what they wanted out of life, I wasn't really teaching them. I was delivering. It was a transactional moment, right? I was delivering something that was handed to me. There's a K-12 researcher by the name of Elizabeth Mohay, and she put it best. She said, I don't teach subjects. I teach students. So if your mentality is I teach a subject, then all you're concerned about is Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 2 to 2:50, what are all the bells and whistles I can cram into that, okay? And then whatever they get out of that process, if they understand concepts, great. I don't want to be dismissive of having some kind of concept mastery. But when we talk about the promise and practice of inclusive teaching, we're talking about a type of education that transcends content, that transcends, you just know the 50 chapters in this textbook, all right? So it's long and it's hard, and it requires really a seismic shift in how you think about the role of the educator. So what I want to do today is walk you through a bit of my own experience in that, all right? And I really want to make this personal for a couple of reasons. Number one, it is very much a personal process. Like how I went through it and the things I did were unique to me and my journey. And you might find you might do some slightly different things. But also, the ways in which the focus of this is how you develop relationships with students. And the development of those relationships is something that is the most personal thing you can do as an educator. All right? This is a paper I published about a month ago. So if you look up, I should have put a citation, but if you look up my last name and cultural studies in science education, you will see it. But when you read that paper, and I cite all of the relevant authorities, and I'll say it again here, this is not new stuff. All right? We have this thing in higher education, and STEM education research in particular. We like to act like, we figured something out while we're having dinner, we publish a paper on it, and act like we transformed the world. All right? They didn't just started flipping classrooms 3 years ago. All right? John Dewey and Paulo Freire and Antonia Dada and Ira Shaw have been talking about relationship-centered teaching in the K-12 world for literally 100 years. All right? For whatever reason, we've ignored all of that because we thought somehow universities were special. But I'm happy to see it reintroduced. But let's be clear, it is very much a reintroduction. This is not, this I didn't come up with this, right? So I cite everybody. And they, of course, talk about the same concept of teaching is a relationship-driven thing. So the beginning of the model starts with self-awareness, all right? Me understanding who I am, what drives me, what makes me want to teach, what my biases are, what my imperfections are. Then once I have a clear understanding of that, there's a lot to do, I do to get to know who my students are on a number of levels, and we'll talk about that. And whatever happens in the classroom is driven by that unique relationship I develop with those students. All right? Let me put it to you this way. I've taught intro bio now for 6 years. Yes, I know I'm young, all right? Give me a break. And I have colleagues who will say to me, I can't teach the same class for more than, 6, 7 years because it gets boring. How could it be the same class? It's 150 different students every single year. And those are 150 unique stories. And so it's 6 very different experiences. So what happens with the whole plug and play approach I talked about, give me 5 things to be inclusive. They will do things without thinking who's in front of them. If your students are working 30 hours a week to make tuition, when are they going to have time to watch a 30-minute lecture every single night? I know the literature says flipped classrooms are good. I know you can move the lecture outside the classroom, all right? But if a student is not feeling a sense of belonging in your class, I don't care how many clickers you use. That's not the point. But if you want just the 10 things, you'll just mindlessly plug from that list and just go do it. So knowing who's in front of you has to be the step that is taken before any of those tricks gets implemented, all right? So I moved from Trinidad to Atlanta, all right? Cultural shock number 1. From Atlanta to Miami, cultural shock number 2. And then from Miami to Rhode Island. And from the rising laughter, I gather you agree with me that was actually the biggest cultural shock of the 3. I like Rhode Island. I really do. It's a strange place at times, but I do like Rhode Island. It definitely took a little bit getting used to it. And like everywhere I've lived and worked or traveled, try to really understand the local context of things. And so what I'm going to talk about now is my experience there, and I'm going to specifically talk about my introductory to biology class, right? I teach 4 classes, but that's sort of my only gateway class. And it's a fall class. It's 150 students enrolled. The other sections tend to have about 200, so we all have pretty large enrollment. Prior to my arrival, DFW rates were in the mid-30s to high 40s. That it ranged. That was a normal thing. So we were also part of the G2C program. The school is, on average, is about 25% underrepresented minorities group. Underrepresented minorities. There's a percentage of them that are first-generation African, who tend to identify a little bit differently than African Americans who are born and raised in America. The class is a survey class, and there's a second semester of it, which I don't teach, but you have to pass the first semester to get to the second semester. All right. So I'm going to talk about my journey, but with fidelity to the model that I just showed you. All right. Stephen Brookfield has a book called Becoming a Critically Reflective Teacher. I highly recommend it. It's a beautiful book, and he really talks about, it's one of the few books on inclusion that I feel that he really positioned himself in the process, right? He talks about his imperfections. He talks about, when he wasn't good and when he thought he was okay, but he still wasn't really that good, and what that journey is like. And these articles, which I wrote a couple of years ago, was my probably smaller version of that. In the Scientific American article, which you can Google, it's free, the Scientific American. Um, I talk about my own upbringing. All right, I'm a preacher's kid. I always have to pause when I say that because you never know how people will react to that. But in the Caribbean, preacher's kid is kind of a stereotype. We're the worst kinds, but I'm a very good boy, I'll have you know. Um, I don't practice anymore. I mean, my dad's retired now, but I grew up, play piano for the church. I did Sunday school, all that good stuff. It was fun. I'm not going to lie to you. Um, but I don't actively practice anymore. What is interesting, though, is I never thought that my experience watching my dad be the pastor of a small church in the Caribbean would come back to impact the way I see and approach my class, right? And this is part of what self-reflection does. It pulls out part of yourself that you hadn't really fully articulated or come to terms with maybe when you were of that particular age. So, no, I don't go to class and take collection and read from the Bible, okay? But we do look at this group of 150 every September and say that our challenge, myself, my learning assistant, our challenge is to help you see how much of a better version of yourself you can become. All right? This is beyond whatever grade you're going to get in the class. Yes, that's important. But our challenge is to help you see that star and follow that, become that better person. So, therefore, the things we put into our curriculum really goes way beyond how DNA replicates itself, right? It's about how do you develop a sense of agency while you learn scientific material. And so I talk a little bit about that in that article. I also take what is called the implicit association test every year. All right. For those of you who don't know, it's a free online tool. If you go to implicit.harvard.edu, you will see that there are a number of categories, and it's without going into too much detail, but it's a response distractor type tool test that, depending on how you score, can tell you that you may have preferences in a particular direction. So they've set up race-based IATs, they've set up sexual orientation, they've set up ageist, a whole number of categories. So if you are interested in understanding how your implicit biases work or what you might have, I would suggest you go to that website and take a few of your own. I would suggest you go when nobody else is in the room. I'm serious, it might actually put you in a dark place. And it's the kind of thing where you may get a result you don't expect, and you may need some time to process it. And give yourself that time, but also what's going to matter is the work you put in to really unpack what that information is. So that's something I do every year. And just by the way, it's called implicit bias, right? We're all human beings. We have brains and we have social structures we grew up in that have made us have preferences that lean one way or the next. Some of those you may not be proud to say out loud, but it doesn't mean it's not a reality. And so what this test is designed to do is to help you kind of see that, unpack it, and put you in a space, hopefully, where you can talk about that. So I'm not perfect either, so I take it and I come face to face with some of what my biases are. So the work on self is ongoing, and so is the work on students. And I want to talk to you about understanding students on 3 different levels. And maybe 3 different levels, not so much hierarchically, but just in terms of view. So this is like 30,000 feet. So who are our students? They are a weird, confused, but beautiful set of adults. I actually spelled his name wrong. It's supposed to be Arnett 2000. J.J. Arnett. If you look up J.J. Arnett 2000, Emerging Adulthood, you'll get a beautiful paper written in Psychology Today, where he describes the 18 to 29-year-old time of life as emerging adults. What does that mean? That means they're not adolescents, but they're certainly not adults. That means that they're going through usually a major transition in their life, like leaving home and being to college and having to manage their own time. It means that they're exploring a lot of things, including their own identity, whether it's their sexual identity, their professional identity, most of the age at which most people, quote unquote, come out the closet is freshman year of college. It's part of the process. All right? They're considered to be self-centered, not selfish. But they're also considered to be full of so much hope and possibilities. They're generally optimists. On a practical level, I see this in class. I see them walk in the room all awkward and trying to be all cool. I see it. It's fine. Right? Trying to, figure out who your new friend group is going to be. Should you lay low in the back and be anonymous, or should you act like you want to please the professor? Should you sit in front or sit on the edge? And then what you do in that situation, unless you're socially engineer your classrooms like I do, you find this space in the class that makes you comfortable. That might be a race, an ethnic group that you think looks like you. That might be people who you happen to know is also in Greek life or other athletes, because it's a new, big, psychologically new space. That's something I think is very, very important for us to understand, because what Dr. Parks talks about in this book is the process of finding identity is actually referred to as faith. Not in the biblical sense, not in the religious sense. I know I'm a preacher's kid, but that's not what I mean here. Faith is actually a non-religious word. Faith, in its historical definition, means the process of meaning-making, the act of finding meaning and purpose. All right? So what emerging adults are trying to do during these 4 to 6 years of college is finding meaning and purpose. And we talk about systems, so recognize we have a system that discourages exploration and penalizes you if you don't know from day one that you're going to be X. Think about it. What happens to the student who wants to be, who's pre-med, right, but misses one semester of this required science course? Does it not completely disrupt their 4-year track? How do we treat undecideds versus how we treat people who, I know I'm going to be a chemical engineer? Like, what systems we have in place to support both? Like, what exactly, are we encouraging people to pick a thing and stick to it? Or are you encouraging people to say, this is a time of your life where you need to find out how you're going to make an impact on the world? And here's a whole bunch of ways in which our institution can help you answer that question. Those are two very different ways of looking at higher ed. So that's 30,000 feet. 10,000 feet. I'm trying to wrap my hand around this very weird small state called Rhode Island. It's funny because, anybody from the Caribbean in here? Anybody from the Caribbean? Damn, my sense of belonging just went way. Okay, I'm kidding. All right, I see a hand in the back. Well, okay, I'm from Trinidad, and the funny thing is, like, if you go to Trinidad divides America into 3 parts: Miami, New York, and not Miami and New York. All right? So when I go home and people ask, oh, yeah, where you living now? I say, oh, yeah, I'm in Rhode Island. Oh, Long Island? No, Rhode Island. It's a state. No, Long Island. So anyways, I had to go back and forth. But yes, a small state, very provincial for a place that's only 1.2 million people. You can trip and fall and end up in Connecticut. Like, is that like, I'm 5 minutes from Massachusetts. But the Northeast I find to be sometimes, I say this with all love in my heart, but maybe a bit sanctimonious. Sometimes there's this feeling that, this impression given that anything racist happens south of the Mason-Dixon line. I'm like, nah, man. Nope. Sometimes you just have to do a little bit of digging, right? 10 minutes from my house, Warren, Rhode Island. I know, small town. Built 95% of the slave ships used in the transatlantic slave trade. Not even a sign, right? The DeWolf family that profited from that, if you go get a tour of their mansion, they will take you through all the parlors where the lady had dinner with her guests. They own the plantations in Cuba and the distilleries in Virginia and the ships. That's how you build the house. So you have to know, you have to look back, and you have to understand that when people talk about why the state is set up the way it is, there are social reasons for that as well. Banco Santander settled a redlining case 3 years ago. 3 years ago, like 2016. All right. So if you don't know what that is, I mean, these would the banks, the federal government would advise banks to, they would give loans or not loans depending on the color of the neighborhood, right? And they would give the neighborhood's color. So red would either get no interest, no loans at all, or really, really high interest rates, right? So that then predicted who can be where. And don't get me started on blockbusting, because that was a whole other level, right? So when you see some of these communities today and you wonder why these high schools just can't do better, if the income is being driven by property taxes and that then is affected by, you have to know the structure, all right? So another book, yes, I love to give homework. It's early in the summer, so you have plenty of time to read all these books. The Color of Law by Rothstein, I think Richard is his first name. All right, The Color of Law, beautiful book. In fact, connection to Michigan, the guy who was fighting the most against redlining was Mitt Romney's dad, George Romney. And I think that's what helped him get booted out to the Nixon administration. Right? So go Michigan. So this other book it's a work of fiction, but it's a book. It's a beautiful book. I think she won a few awards for it. Since a lot of my students are from Africa, this book is really about the perspective of race and class relationships in America from the perspective of an international person of color. And, I have students who tell me in confidence that their parents forbid them from dating African Americans. All right, they have, it's very interesting. We could have a whole other lecture on that. All right, but when we do things like just bin people in these arbitrary census categories, you miss some of the nuance associated with how people cope with social belonging. All right, and I went through that myself. All right, I'll be fully honest with you. I went to Morehouse in 1999. That school is a historically black college. It was 99% black. There were actually 3 white boys. I remember them clearly. I would go across town to Emory to take a break from Morehouse. Because in Trinidad, Trinidad is 40% Indian, 40% black, and then a mix of a bunch of stuff. Like, I wasn't used to that environment. So it's weird sort of looking like your environment, but still actually feeling a really low sense of belonging because I wasn't accustomed to African American culture. I mean, I did eventually, right? So this helps me empathize a bit more with students of color who don't have a similar perspective to African American students, all right? And that book really, really gets into that theme. All right, so that's 15,000 feet. So now I am on the ground, and on the ground I mean before the fall. So let's say my URI is going to start this year on September 4th, right? I think that's a Wednesday. Right now the freshmen are enrolling, so my roster should be filled probably by the end of this month. By August 1st, the Institutional Research Office, and by that I mean a guy named Gary, sends me a spreadsheet with all of the names, the clubs they were in high school GPA, Pell status. I mean, basically anything I ask him for. I then send them a 10-question survey on SurveyMonkey, and I ask them things like, when last did you take a science class? How do you feel about group work? Hate it. What strengths do you bring to this experience? And let me be clear about this. I am not doing this to create like a static model, right? I'm not saying, oh, you came in with a low high school GPA, therefore you're going to fail my class. But if I can get a bit of an academic profile of who's coming in, I can better prepare more specifically, all right? I even asked them to predict their grade in the class, which tells me a little bit about what their personal expectations of themselves are. I then follow that up with this assignment. And I hate to rank things, as you can probably tell, but I will in this case. This for me has to be the single most powerful thing I think I have done as an educator. I suspect that many of the students who complete this assignment have never been asked to reflect in this way. If you don't know what this is I think it's every Wednesday on public radio. They have a oral essay program called I Believe. If you go to that website, it tells you if you're interested in using this for your classroom, it gives you the prompt and the length and everything. All right. I send this assignment to the students before I see them. All right. 500 words. Part of the prompt says, talk about things that have shaped your values. So what you realize I'm trying to ask them is, as you emerge into adulthood, talk about the exploration of your identity. What are the things that are most important to you? Sometimes they'll talk about a dog they asked the parents for, or, wanting to be a doctor because, they just find them so fascinating. But sometimes they will talk about, I buried my mother from a heroin overdose. All right, so we had a major, major heroin and fentanyl epidemic in New England. All right, so it's close to home. Like, people lose 10, 12 high school classmates from this stuff. People, sometimes the essays are about living in their car for 2 years. A lot of times the essays are about, I'm not really a science person, but my mom really wants me to become a doctor, so here I am. All right? I've gotten C's in science classes throughout, so I expect to get a C in this, because I'm not really that kind of person. So the value of this process is, once you read this, you cannot unread it. See, higher ed is set up for this to be transactional, right? So I see you for the first time on the first day of class. I walk in, 20 slides a day, 3 days a week. Every 3 weeks or so, I give you a big test. You come crying to me if it doesn't work out, and then after 3 months, I say goodbye forever. All right? Right? But in the process, you're really like 150 randomly student ID people, right? You might get to know like a couple people, but there's sort of an assumption of sameness without gathering this kind of information. But once you open up to me in that way, it's unethical for me to walk into a classroom and pretend you don't have individual stories. So when you tell me that I don't think I can be X, now I have to adapt my pedagogy, I have to adapt my teaching to help you develop a sense of confidence. I have to do specific and intentional things to teach you that, yes, you can develop a sense of agency because you have told me this is the thing that I need. This is the thing that I don't see in myself. So now my job is to teach you that you can. So this assignment is what opens the class up to be something entirely different. Then, that is followed up by, and during the semester, constant dialogue. Like everything I've said so far, it's again, look, we're like halfway in. I haven't even talked about content yet. Right? And that's intentional. All right? And so is the dialogue. What do I mean by this? I have 150 students. I can't have a half an hour meeting with all of them. All right? And so usually when I say dialogue, that's what people first think. I have run into students either when they've graduated or they've taken the class, they're juniors, seniors. And many of them have said, when you said that thing in class about X, it really changed the way I thought about career or my life. I don't remember what I said. But it doesn't matter. They remember. Right? So you see, when you're teaching content, what I care about in content is Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Can you duplicate DNA? Can you explain transcription? Whatever. When you're teaching students, every interaction you have with a student is an opportunity for education to happen. So dialogue is every email I send. Dialogue is every time I run into them on the way to class and I ask, how are you doing? You look a little tired today. Dialogue is when I'm in front of the classroom and I'm seeing eyes withdrawing and I pause to take a temperature to see how are you feeling, right? Without just continuing. Dialogue is the fact that office hours is not in my office. It's in the basement of the student dorm. Because otherwise it makes no sense. I have 2 chairs and 150 students in 2 hours. Like, what impact could I create with that? But we're averaging 30, 35 students because it changes the whole dynamic when I've set up a space for us to actually have dialogue. As opposed to this Green Mile kind of thing where you walk down the long, lonely hall to my office at the end of the darkly lit room. So dialogue is a very intentional thing. So you see all the work we put into building those relationships, right? And every semester we're very thoughtful about that. And as we gather that information, we think about what do we need to do to create a sense of community in this classroom, and to create that sense of purpose and have students trust the process. So I'll mention a couple things here. As you could probably tell, there's a lot happening in my intro bio class. Like, if you really, I invite you to come, right? I have an open door policy. We leave like 1 chair for Elijah, but other than that, okay, that was a Jewish joke. Nobody got, okay, it's cool. But we have open chairs. Just come in anytime. Doesn't make sense for an exam. But it's really the learning outcomes is what matters, and what we do, so long as it helps address that, it could be a variety of things, right? So I'm just pointing out a couple of things we do in response to what students share through the essays or what we learn through the data, all right? Number one big thing is creating opportunities for dialogue. What do I mean by that, right? So I talked about dialogue between myself and the students. In this case, I'm talking about dialogue between the students and the students. You may know it as group work. I don't call it that, right? We call them teams, but pedagogically speaking, we don't think of it as group work, because what happens with group work a lot, especially with STEM faculty, again, literature says active learning works. Group work is back to active learning, so just form groups and magic will happen. If you're not being intentional about how those groups are constructed, the behavior that occurs within the group, and the skills associated with working effectively with difference, then you are just replicating the same inequitable structures on a smaller scale. All right? So those who are not confident sharing their voice will be overpowered by the helium hands. All right? Those who haven't learned the language of respect and tolerance will just use that unchecked. All right? If there's no markers for them to learn from what they're doing. All right? So when I get that spreadsheet, we socially engineer the groups. It's 150 students in groups of 4, auditorium style, whatever, but groups of 4. And we make sure there's a lot of mixing, all right, across a bunch of different things, all right? And we really think about what are the activities, what are the major homework assignments and the things that the groups do, because we want to make sure that the people in the group actually engage, right? So the quality of the assignment has to be high. It can't be set up in such a way that the one overachiever just does it because they want to get the grade and move on. You have to force them to actually do stuff in the group, because otherwise, what's the point of doing a group, right? There's a bigger message here, and that is, think about what your mental definition of diversity, equity, and inclusion is, all right? If you have X thousands of students coming into your university, what are the mechanisms you have in place to teach them what it really means to work with and work across ideological differences? And what better place is there, all right, for them to learn how to do that than in your own classroom, when they have to actually do work with people who are different from them? So on most campuses, when people say diversity, what they mean is the MLK breakfast. What they mean is Hispanic Heritage Month, right? The United Colors of Benetton poster where everybody holds hands and, all lives matter. No. We have to get serious about this. And then that's what the dialogue is set up to do. So they tackle really, really tough questions, ethical questions too. where they have to give their own opinions and dig deep. and we set up conflict management sessions for groups that may be having some struggle, because in dealing with the conflict, they learn more and more about themselves and what it means to work with others. This is the class logo. So this gets at the confidence piece. The assumption here that your roommate is not your major. I would much rather it be not their major, because, if it's a business major versus a bio major, they are less likely to have some history in the subject, right? And so the challenge is, I'm not going to examine you on how well you can nod your head while I explain something to you. I'm not going to examine you on how well you can read something. I'm going to examine you. The assessments are set up so that you need to clearly articulate your understanding of this particular problem, right? That's what's called doing science. Yeah, you can you can ABCD your way to a grade in some courses and not actually know what the hell you just did. And so let's be clear here, because a lot of times people assume when we talk about inclusive, blah, 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 well, you have to drop the rigor. No. We don't curve. We don't give extra credit. We do none of that stuff. It's a hard class. But we support the hell out of them. All right? Wherever you are, there is something in this system we've set up so that you can have an entry point and develop a sense of agency. So the key with that slogan is both, that is how we determine mastery, at least at the freshman level, in that course. But the other key to it is, one key piece about being an emerging adult is learning how to advocate for yourself. It's developing a sense of agency. Can you imagine how transformative it is for a student who's first generation, coming from a high school where they worksheeted their way to graduation? Some of them haven't done science since middle school and are standing in front of me and explaining to me how a DNA molecule makes a secondary and a tertiary protein structure. Sorry to get all nerdy on you for a second, but I use the vernacular intentionally because it's not just knowing it, right? It's the pride and the confidence that comes with being able to do that articulation. That does things that are beyond content, all right? And that's why the articulation piece is so necessary. So, in 2014, and I just want to show you some of this data here. There's a documentary called Waiting for Superman, which I had mixed feelings on. I mean, it's good. Jeffrey Canada, I believe, Harlem Children's Zone. And one of the pieces that came out of that, and this is where it helps be married to a K-12 instructor. This is hard work. Part of systems is there's this notion in STEM education research that we're all looking for that big predictor, that when we find it, this is what predicts success in STEM, blah, 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 and this is what's going to close the equity gap. And when we find that thing, that one thing, then every university, everywhere, in every context, in every part of the country will just use that thing and fix their own school. And that's not how this works, all right? Be prepared to fall flat on your face a couple times, all right? Look in the mirror and figure out where you messed up, and then pick yourself back up, right? And so we had to do that our first semester. We came in with all these plans. Just to explain the graph a bit, unproductive grades in our context is below a C, right? So you have to get a C or above to get into the second semester of bio, right? So students of color were getting these grades about, 3 to 4 times the rate of white students, right? So it wasn't just an overall bad rate, but when you disaggregated the data, it was even more shocking. And this, unfortunately, is not unique to URI. So we took a hard look at what we were doing. All right, we were section 4, by the way. So before we arrived, there were only 3 sections. So my section was about the same in the first semester. By the following fall, especially after implementing a pretty aggressive early intervention mechanism, those numbers changed drastically. All right. Since then, we still average like over 10 or 11% DFW. Not bad. We like to get that lower. It depends on the semester. But after fall 2015, and I laughed when Glenn talked about Statue of Liberty because that's exactly what we became. All right. So I'll explain to you my context. This student doesn't look, I don't know, these credentials don't look that high, but let's send them to Bryan's class because he does that special. Or I think you and Dr. Dewsbury will have, I don't know, I think you will have like a good cultural connection. So URI is 23% URM. My class last semester was what, 61? If you ever wondered what cultural tax is, that's what it is, right? Because here's the problem. I am kind of like that. I literally am like that. When I walk in class, I don't ask questions. Once you walk in that front door, you're my child, right? And I am sort of agnostic to the background, to the distribution. Whoever's in this room, it is my job to make you a better version of yourself, right? As an institution, if you find some pocket of your campus where there's some small amount of success dealing with a nagging issue that you have on an institutional level, the response can't be, let's now force feed everything into that small corner. The response has to be, what can we learn from that in order to scale what's working? Because the people who are taking on all that load are going to get tired. They're going to get tired. We talk about retention of faculty, right? Because what happens is you do and and then one day you wake up, it's like, this is not worth it. Right? I can't work weekends. I have 2 small kids. And so when we talk about systemic change, and I hear the word thrown around a lot, I really want to impress upon you, it's harder and more explosive than you might think. All right? We had to stop like workshopping our way to solutions. All right? You can't plenary speaker your way to a solution. You have to look at everything from how you award tenure, from how you evaluate your teaching, to how do you hold everybody accountable to being to being part of diverse initiatives and to doing the work. What books are you reading, right? What book is being read in the faculty learning community? What goes into that annual teaching report? What have you done to ask the students about the experiences, and what have you done to respond specifically to that? That's how you take the work away from the statues, all right? So if you disaggregate the data for the following 3 years, for whatever reason, I have a very, very low to non-existent Asian enrollment, so that's why that is. Those are the average grades. So we wish the average performance was higher, but we're happy that we at least don't have any equity gaps between when we disaggregate the data. All right? That wasn't like that every single semester, but on average, that's how it is. By the way, section 1 is why you really need to disaggregate the data. All right? So if you have on average 20 to 25 students, black students in your class, and over 3 years, they average like 0.5 GPA, like D minus basically, then there's something that you might be doing. But we could talk about that later. So I just want to close real quickly by telling you, because here's the thing, okay, I teach the class, I design the assessments, I write the syllabus, I write the exams. So I don't want that they come, they do well, and then they go on to the other classes, and then they fall flat, right? Because if people are, if the criticism is, well, you're making it easier, then in fact that's what would happen. Because we actually cut out 30% of the content. It's still very hard, but we decided to go deep instead of wide, right? So we tracked the students as best as we could, and we basically divided them to 4 categories. Category 1, sections 1 to 3, so gray is intro bio, right? 1 to 3 is a very conventionally styled taught, lecture. And then the second semester bio, there are 2 sections. The double asterisk is conventional, the person whose initial is S is active. And then, assuming you pass both of that, you'll go on to 200 level classes. So the 4 categories are 1 to 3, double asterisk, 200. All right, so those students got no inclusive, no active learning. Category 2, 1 to 3, S, 200. So they just got the second semester of active learning. Category 3, B, which stands for, thank you, oh Jesus, 5 of you all remember my name, I see you, thank you. All right, so B, and then double asterisk, so 1 semester of active learning, 200. And then category 4, BS, which is our initials, 2 semesters, and then 200 level, okay? So, at least so far, the biggest difference seems to be if you got both semesters versus if you got no semesters of it at all, right? So these are students in the 200 level classes. Again, we cut out 30% of the content to focus more on inclusion, to focus more on depth, all right? But still on average, our students are performing at a B+ level compared to the peers who are not. So the idea that we are actually harming students or teaching them less, making them less prepared, that doesn't hold any water. So this bench, if you go to Morehouse campus, this bench is right in the middle of the campus. And at the end of my freshman orientation week, my parents sat me down, and neither of my parents went to college, right? So I'm a first-generation student. And I think this is typical of the Caribbean, where the parents don't tell you about their history. Maybe when you're 9, they don't want to tell you about all this stuff in their past. So they shield you from a lot of that stuff, right? So I grew up a pretty middle-class lifestyle, at least in my perception. But I wasn't made aware of the sacrifices that were made to make that middle-class lifestyle appear middle-class to me and my siblings. So at the end of that week, my dad and my mom sat me down on that table, and my dad looked at me and said, I've taken you as far as I can take you. Good luck. And I didn't appreciate in the moment what that really meant, what he meant by that. But now what I've come to understand is that when I got that first C-, he didn't know what to tell me, right? In fact, when I was in danger of losing my scholarship, which I was at the end of my sophomore year, the advice was, well, you tried, right? Right? Like, I mean, they didn't have the capital to bestow upon you and say, oh, go see an advisor, go to tutoring. And it only is when, and this is part of being an emerging adult, it's only when I become an actual adult, which I think I am, right? When you can look back and understand what it meant to have navigated all of this, and what navigating all of this meant to somebody who grew up as one of 13 siblings in extreme poverty, who you just sort of figured, well, if you could just get them to college, maybe something good will happen. I can't tell you what to do when you get there, but I'm going to send you over there to fertile ground in the hope that magic happens. So I appreciate now, at 39, and him being 76, what seeing that magic means, right? When I say I'm going to go give a talk, he doesn't know, well, he cares, but he doesn't know particularly what I'm going to talk about. But he just needs to know that it happened. That it happened. That generation took that next step. And when I look back, I realize that next step was only taken because there was a couple professors right, who saw me struggling and realized that if they didn't teach to me, the student, I would have been another statistic. I was adapting, using all the bad study strategies. I was, the not up to scratch. And these kids today, yeah, I was part of that, right? Physics was horrible. Organic chem was horrible. Math was okay, As one of them took the time to pull me aside and said, you could be better than this. And they didn't just say it. It wasn't just an empty platitude. They gave me specific things to change. So when I'm in a classroom today, I don't just do this. And this is my self-reflection piece, right? I don't just do this because, I'm a research professor. You have to teach. I like intro bio. I love bio. I want you to be excited about life. Yeah, all of that. I have a responsibility to pass that on. I have a responsibility to pay that forward. All right? So I challenge you to look into your own mirror and figure out what your paid forward is. We are a land-grant institution at URI. All right, in case you didn't know, it's created by the Moral Act of 1862. And this is language that came directly from that act. All right? So it's not just what I'm chasing, right? I'm chasing those people to be better versions of themselves. But as an institution, we were created to expand opportunities to all social classes. So what are you running down? Are you running down NCAA tournament teams? Are you running down football stadiums? Are you running down U.S. News and World Report rankings? What are you chasing? Think deeply. If these kinds of things are in your strategic plan, you have to go as deep as you can to make sure you're being, you are aligned with that model. And that means whoever steps foot on that campus, that is now my responsibility. Thank you so much.